Hello, my name is Chung. I run the painting program with the Fine Art Department at UAA, and I'm here to talk to you today about a couple projects that involve diversity, equity, and inclusion with what I do at UAA. The first project that I wanted to talk about is the Scrimshaw unit of my experimental drawing class. One of the classes that I teach is experimental drawing, and the point of that course is to introduce to students unorthodox materials and processes that they may not ordinarily encounter in regular classes. And one of my favorite units within that is the Scrimshaw unit. Scrimshaw is the art of etching into bone and filling those scratched marks with pigment. And it is considered by historians to be the only art form that was birthed and originated in America. And it's considered that the sailors on whaling crews in the early 1800s were the ones that invented this art form. And I cover this history for my students, but I also use this history to talk to them about Eurocentricity, the idea that the Western history of the world is the only one. Because what's closer to the truth of the history of Scrimshaw is that those sailors in the 1800s would have encountered indigenous peoples of the Arctic who were already etching into bone and filling those scratched lines with pigment. And so the closer to the reality is that the sailors were inspired by a pre-existing art form. And what's exciting about this unit also is that a lot of the Alaska Native groups participated in this type of art of etching into bone and filling in those cracks with pigment. And so my students get to learn not only about sort of general American history as it relates to this art form, but it's specifically relevant to Alaska. I also show my students some contemporary examples of Scrimshaw that range from Star Wars characters to classic sailing scenes. And here are a couple images of what my students did when I let them try their hand at Scrimshaw. I had them working in boar tusks, which is a legal material for anybody to work with, and fossilized ivory, which is also legal for any student to work from regardless of their background. And vegetarian students were given resin objects to Scrimshaw as an alternative. This is another student Scrimshaw piece. The student used pointillism, just dots, to create the illusion of shading. So my Scrimshaw unit is one of many that introduce the idea of non-Western art forms or non-Western ways of looking at the world. When you start looking at non-Western cultures, you find a completely different understanding of things like color, and you find a completely different understanding of things like perspective and where you place a viewer in a piece. And so it can be really exciting for my students to have their eyes open to these different ways of approaching reality and vision and art making. So I want to talk about one other project, and this is in relation to COVID-19. We were asked to comment on how our teaching has been affected by COVID-19. And so I wanted to give an example of one of my projects that I came up with that was very heavily impacted by COVID-19. So in September, I organized a handful of former UAA painting students for a mural project downtown in Anchorage. And we were asked to comment on climate change. And I designed this composition so that way we could all be working at the same time. There was enough safe space between each of these window forms that my students could develop their ideas and work independently and safely together. And I also wanted to talk about this project because my students have really embraced sort of valuing non-Western thoughts and valuing non-Western ways of looking at the world. And I think that this mural project really demonstrates that. And so I want to show you some of those windows. Each of my students were allowed to come up with their own idea in response to this question of climate change. What wisdom can you share in relation to climate change? I did a couple of windows, and mine is a depiction of my sort of Buddhist beliefs and the idea that we can learn from our mistakes, that in Buddhism, the mistakes that we make are invaluable to the cultivation of wisdom. And so even something as dire as climate change within the Buddhist philosophy could be considered a catalyst for growth and the impetus for being better, for cultivating wisdom. My student Cassie did a piece heavily influenced by the philosopher Alan Watts, who was one of the first Western philosophers to bring in Eastern ideas to the West. And her text at the bottom of her mural refers to the Eastern Taoist belief that man and everything that man makes can be seen as an extension of nature, as inseparable from nature, as opposed to the sort of popular Western notion of man being kind of separate from nature, separate from God. I have a window from my student Simone. She chose to do a Lakota story that talks about the importance of valuing what is sacred and the turbulent times that we live in now. My student Lena chose to comment on the income disparity as it relates to climate change. It's a gesture that feels familiar to someone like Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist that dedicated his life to talking about wealth inequality and injustice. And that's just another image of the wall. And so I hope that in talking about a couple of these projects today, I can give you a sense of how important it can be to kind of appreciate and think about worldviews other than the mainstream Western worldview. The idea of decolonization is really important in the arts these days, and it's the shift from this really pretty globalized mindset that the Western way of doing things is superior. And globally, you know, as Americans, we are shifting more to this idea that values non-Western ways of looking at the world as valid, as equally valid to the West. And that's a principle that I try to instill in all my students, the value of that type of perspective. And I try to expose them to some of those non-Western ways of looking at things, because I think that that shift in perspective is needed now more than ever. Thank you.